Wait, you have a startup. You're not working 80 hours a week? I'm going to tell your investors on you. But I know founders who are 4 or 5 years in and they're like, oh yeah, I only work 80 hours a week. Personally, I'm a fan of work-life integration. The idea that there's an entitlement to your time. In the Valley, there's an expectation just that like developers work 50, 60-hour weeks.
Let's say hypothetically you work 100 hours. And you're not going to be productive all 100 hours.
It's ridiculous to suggest that there's no value in the next 40 after the first 40. Crunch time is you are expecting to get to the end of it. Burnout is the result of not seeing progress. I view crunch time as a failure in the release process.
Hi, I'm Paul Bigger, founder of Circle CI.
I'm Edith Harba, CEO and co-founder at Launch Darkly.
And you're listening to Be Continuous, a podcast about continuous delivery and software development.
You can get in touch with us anytime at our Twitter handle @ContinuousCast.
The show is brought to you by HeavyBit. To learn more, visit heavybit.com. And while you're there, check out their library, home to great educational talks from other developer company founders and industry leaders.
So I guess today we're talking about working hours.
Yeah, there's a couple really interesting articles in VentureBeat recently. One from the president of the Game Developers Conference talking about how crunch time was an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And then
a bad thing.
A bad thing.
Okay.
A bad thing. And then a second response saying that crunch time was something that people should not only expect, but relish.
Okay. I would be interested to see why should you expect and relish crunch time?
So the second time article was basically saying, well, people who work in games should be passionate about their games. And as such, they should expect to be working, basically 70 to 100 hours every week.
Gotcha. This is the. I can't help but feel that like Marx would have something to say about this. That would be particularly relevant.
Well, it's funny because the second guy actually took a very Marxian slant. He's like that you shouldn't be a wage slave.
Uh-huh.
And then he twisted that argument back upon itself. He's like, you shouldn't be a wage slave. You should expect to work really hard because you consider yourself an owner of your company.
I see. Except you're not an owner of your company. The owner. I mean, so as an owner of my company, I feel that the sort of when people complain that there's no mission involved, that I disagree strongly. You should be working at a place that is like mission driven, and I very much am a fan of. Personally, I'm a fan of work-life integration, although Circle ended up being much more work-life separation. But I'm also not particularly sympathetic to the idea that like you should be doing this or that like 70 to 100 hours a week is anything that's justified. Reading through that article, it seemed like pure exploitation. And the games industry in general seems like pure exploitation.
Well, it was basically, so the slant of the article was like, well, you love games, so you should love games so much you spend all your time on them. But I think that's very short-sighted for a couple different reasons. It assumes that let's say hypothetically you work 100 hours. Mm-hmm. You're not going to be productive all 100 hours.
Right.
I have a friend who, he was working at a small startup, and they said, we expect you to work 80 hours a week.
Okay, and so he quit the next day, I presume.
Well, he said, we expect you to work 80 hours a week.
Okay.
And we know that the last 40 will not be as productive, but that's fine. We're still getting value.
So I think that it's ridiculous to suggest that there's no value in the next 40 after the first 40, right? The 41st hour is almost as good as the 40th. The 42nd is pretty good as well. And you're definitely not going to get twice as much. But the problem I have there is the idea that there's an entitlement to your time.
Yeah.
I think that there's some entitlement to your time, right? That's what you're paying for. But there's a reason we ended up at 40 hours a week. And in the Valley, there's an expectation just in tech in general that like developers work 50, 60-hour weeks, and everyone in it works 50, 60-hour weeks. And that's kind of on the upper range of what I think is reasonable. But to suggest 80-hour weeks is
exploitative.
It's just pure exploitation.
Yeah, and then what happened is my friend quit that job.
Good. The next day, I hope.
Well, no, it was sad because he's like, oh, let me try this for a little bit. It'll mean, because he used to go home and code at night on his side projects.
Right.
So when he's like, I'll just stop coding on my side projects.
Right.
So he tried it and he's like, I can't do this anymore. So I think these companies that try to do these crazy hours, they just have a different mentality of we will grind out people.
Sure, and you see this in Amazon a little bit. So Amazon had that culture document where generally the view that I've seen of Amazon is that they grind through people, and some people survive in that. I think they would describe it as high pressure, but let's just call it exploitative environment. Yeah, and some people don't. Yeah,
I mean, I disagree with it fundamentally. I read a good response. So he said, It's basically, great, you want me to work 100% more hours than my salary originally was supposed to be for.
Yeah.
I don't get double pay.
Right. And it's funny because there's already a disproportional leverage that you get from working in software. So often the person producing producing the code is producing 10 or 20 times the value that they're actually being paid for.
Yeah, but the thing is, when you're working 80 or so, I used to work those crazy hours. I mean, I literally remember I would.
Wait, you have a startup. You're not working 80 hours a week?
Oh, I mean, crazy hours.
I'm going to tell your investor.
So I'll tell one story and then I'll tell a second story. I used to get up, I would go to work, I would work till the bar stopped running, which was midnight. I would go home and I would sleep 6 hours. I would go back to work.
Okay.
And then I would come in and I would work on Sundays. And I mean, I got a lot done, but it was miserable.
Yeah. I mean, the reason that we're referring to it as exploitation is that it burns you out. It's completely unsustainable. It affects you physically, it affects you mentally, and you're miserable. If people worked 80 hours a week and were happy, then I don't think we'd call it exploitation.
Yeah, I mean, so IBM in Austin was notorious for this. So when I lived in Austin, so Austin was a place where they actually filmed Office Space.
Okay.
So have you seen Office Space?
Of course.
Oh, I never know. I mean, you're Irish.
We get movies there too.
Really?
No.
So the joke in Office Space is you're going to have to come in on Saturday.
Right.
But it was true. I had friends who worked at IBM and they would get a memo we have mandatory Saturdays.
Wow.
We will check that you're at your desk. Yeah, and I mean, my friend said it was just a miserable time because everybody had to be there.
Okay.
And it wasn't.
And then they just were they working or were they just there?
At the end, they were just well, fuck this. Because
Right.
literally they were told, we will go around and we will count who's at the desks.
So there's a practice that I do agree with, which is similar to this, or it sort of looks similar externally to this, and that's a work-life integration. I think that especially when you're in the early years of your career and let's say you're working at a startup, you're probably going to love your job. You're probably going to be accomplishing things and learning at this incredibly vast rate. And you're probably going to really, really benefit from working 60 to 80 hour weeks.
Well, so the sad part about me back when I used to come in and work on Sunday, part of it was that I lost touch with everybody who I didn't work with.
Right.
So I would literally be I don't have anything to do today.
Right.
Because I don't have any friends anymore. So let
this
me
is-
go into work. And it was really sad.
This is why I refer to it as work-life integration, because I think that the people who work for these companies often you see a lot of people moving to San Francisco after college and they make friends with everyone they work with. And so they work with them, they hang out with them in the evening, they go out partying with them on weekends, they go hiking together on Sundays. This is...
It was like that except for the not working part.
Okay, you just worked all the time.
We just worked all the time.
Right.
Literally all the time.
Right.
Yeah, so it was ultimately a very depressing look back on.
Right. So, this is kind of the problem, that there's versions of this which are awesome and there's versions of this which are not awesome. And whether they're awesome or not is often a function of where you are in your life at that time and how you want to be.
Yeah, and I think also, so you said, I'll tell your investors. I mean, I think there's definitely a time in every company's cycle when they do have a crunch time.
Right, exactly.
When you are here's when I need to put my foot on the gas and move. But I think every company has that time when they're hey, we need to work a little bit harder.
Right.
But the difference is whether this is a time when we need to put so that's the original article about crunch time, is then you go to perpetual crunch time.
Right. Perpetual crunch time is ridiculous and soul destroying. It should probably be illegal.
But I 100% agree that if you're in a startup that you have to have times where you're hey,
Right.
I mean, I regularly...
So sometimes there's a deadline that you have to hit.
Or-
Right? There's a demo coming, there's a presentation, there's a launch. So you see a lot of startups that have moved away from the idea of, roadmaps and launches and deadlines and that sort of thing. It's we'll ship it when it's ready. GitHub is a good example of this. Or GitHub in the old days is a good example of this. And I'm not sure if they still subscribe to that philosophy. And I think that sort of thing makes a lot of sense, but sometimes it just there is a deadline for some external reason and you have to hit it.
And I think for me, I mean, not to talk about me, I firstly feel the weight very much, because I'm the founder.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, yeah.
It's I always feel there's something more I could be doing.
Right, you feel physical pain, or at least I did, at something that's wrong with your product or something that like isn't shipping or a customer emailing you with a problem. It's like it hurts to feel that sometimes.
Yeah, it's like there's always more you could be doing.
Right.
So it is very hard as a founder to not burn out.
Right. And especially like the first few years as a founder are really tough.
Yeah.
After a certain number of years, or once you've hit certain milestones, or the company has enough people, or you've farmed out your role to enough other people that you can take a little bit of a break. But I know founders who are 4 or 5 years in, and they're like, oh yeah, now I only work 80 hours a week.
Yeah, I mean, it was really nice. We just, so I've been doing all our sales, and we just have too much for me to handle. Like, I literally can't take a break because people start emailing me, like, where's our quote?
Yeah.
Like, we want to buy. And so I was very, very happy because we hired our first salesperson. I'm like, I can finally, like, when I go to a conference, I don't have to basically work a double shift.
Yeah.
Of, you at the conference, then you go home and you work another 8 hours.
Yeah.
So you wrote a pretty inflammatory article that got a lot of hacker news.
This is the News Tilt one, like 6 years ago or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that got a lot of flame, but all right. So the article was called "Why We Shut Down News Tilt," and it was the company I did about 6 years ago. It was in a space I shouldn't have been, and all sorts of problems with it.
I actually really like that blog piece.
Oh, thank you.
It's about News Tilt and the lessons that Paul learned.
Right. So inherently, it was a blog post about failure. Like, why didn't we get it? Why didn't we make it work? Why didn't it work? What was wrong with it? And what did we learn from it? And I remember at the time, a lot of people said, like, you shouldn't publish this.
Did you think it was because it was, like, now everybody's, like, it's like one of the pinnacles of Maslow's hierarchy is to publish a medium piece about your failure.
Right. I'm a failure hipster. I failed before it was cool. So one of the reasons I'm very happy to have published this is like I get emails every now and then. They've kind of died down, but at one point I was getting one every like few months or so of people who are saying like, my company is not doing too well. I don't know what to do. And just like feeling this massive amount of stress. They're in perpetual crunch time, but they're sort of like banging their head against a brick wall. And one of the things that I feel about crunch time in general and burnout in general is that burnout is the result of not seeing progress.
Yeah.
And the way that relates to crunch time is crunch time is a sort of like you are expecting to get to the end of it. You will have a launch, you will have an event, and then you will take 2 days off and you will go whitewater rafting or something. And then you'll come back refreshed to start like a more meaningful or slower pace or normal pace sort of thing. And so if you can never see the end of that crunch time, then there's burnout is inevitable and very, very quickly.
Yeah, well, it's like for me, I was like, so we had these crazy releases we were trying to put out. I was working these crazy hours. I basically lost touch with all of my friends because, if somebody asks you 3 times to do something, every time you say no.
Yeah, then they stop asking you.
Yeah. And so finally, like, I just literally took some time off. I was like, I need to take some time off. It was very helpful.
Right.
I think there's nothing wrong with crunch time. I think what's wrong with it is the perpetual crunch time. And I think that's just management basically not recognizing that they need to invest in people or not caring or I don't know.
I think there's this idea that crunch time is necessary. And I view crunch time as a failure in the release process.
I view it as a failure of management to plan.
Right.
Like
and the people who get punished are the people who didn't cause the problem.
Yeah, well, it's basically, so I mean, that's part of why I'm such a big fan of continuous delivery. It was because what used to happen is you would have the reason why we had crunch time is we had this massive year-long release. And the longer it took, the more stuff we wanted to put into it.
Right, the more crunchy it gets as a result.
Because like all our competitors are moving forward.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, we haven't done a release it for a long time, so it needs to be even more.
Yep.
And it got to the point where, so my manager actually had 3 schedules.
Okay.
He had a schedule he would show to marketing where everything was fine. He had a schedule which was engineering's, which was like everything is completely fucked up.
Okay.
And like, so he basically kept these parties very carefully separated.
Why?
Because he was basically, I mean, he had a complete mental breakdown. Like he was trying to show everybody that like everything was okay.
Okay.
So to marketing, he would say like everything's perfectly on schedule.
Yeah.
To engineering, he would agree like we were completely fucked.
I mean, surely this is a disaster for
This
both.
was a disaster.
Okay, it's all right.
This was a disaster.
I thought this was being held up as like how to carefully manage that.
No, it was a complete disaster because marketing kept trying to squish much more stuff in, and engineering is like, what the fuck?
Right.
And eventually the guy got fired and had a mental breakdown.
In that order.
No, mental breakdown, then fired.
But
it was a bad situation.
Right. So I think in the games industry, right? So I've a friend who's in the games industry, and she's going through this sort of thing now. There's a release coming, and so it's just, you know, you're working late, you're spending time, a lot more time, and my sense on it in some of the things that I've heard is like, does that really need to ship the first time? Like, the games industry is moving to, or in many cases has moved to a model where like patches are expected.
Yep.
A lot of the work is being done in the server anyway. Yep. You're no longer putting something on a gold disk and shipping it for a certain date.
Yep.
Now, something very often still goes on a gold disk and ships at a certain date. But if the last 3 levels of the game didn't ship on day 1 and instead were included in the thing that went out a week later, probably no one would notice.
I mean, that's what we ended up doing on the project I was talking about. We had a lot of delegated administration, basically allowing people to pass permissions on to other people.
Okay.
And we just decided to not ship that at all the first release. Like
Exactly.
Everybody
right.
was a super admin.
You cut things that you need, and everyone who is in the product market fit, minimal viable product part of the world sees that, right?
Well, this was in 2000.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, impressive.
So I mean, and that was kind of my first. That's why I was such a convert to
Right.
lean and
Yeah.
product market. So it's like we were killing ourselves to build something
Right.
before we even really knew the market.
So games have this strong idea of what they're going to ship, right? They know already because there's well-defined genres. They do a lot of play testing, and they do get, you know, one launch event. So that there's a feeling that things have to be probably a lot more perfect than they really have to be.
Well, I think that's interesting because you could really decompose games. Like, because games take a while to progress through levels.
Right.
So a really interesting lean game would be to just like build the first 3 levels.
And many games don't even have levels, right? Many games are you continually play Bejeweled, or you're in a multiplayer MMORPG, right? And there's these things that are released late, but there's also game dynamics that are released late.
Yeah, I mean, Zynga is the king of that.
Exactly. So every game today has economies that they experiment with. Well, just lots and lots of experiments.
Yeah.
And so they could cut a lot of what they're going to ship.
And they do. I mean,
And they do. And I would argue maybe not enough.
So Zynga is really interesting. Part of why they were so successful is their first thing was just, can we draw people into this game at all? Mm-hmm. And then let's start experimenting on the game mechanics, but just can we get people to show up to play?
Right.
And I think they took advantage of a lot of Facebook loops that just are not available anymore. Mainly because Facebook is like, why are we leeching all this money to Zynga instead of keeping it? But we drifted far away from your postmortem, I failed before it was cool.
So I think the thing that you're pointing to in that blog post is something I said that was very controversial that people did not like. And that was, there was an engineer that we were looking to hire, and we had just met, we had just started working with him. Like we're within a week of starting to work with him.
So you'd hired him.
It was either hired or on the cusp of hiring, or in that sort of nebulous, first employee, are we working together? Are we not sort of period. Now, so this was back when we had very little funding. It was much less concrete than things were later. And so I said in the article that it was a Sunday and he wasn't willing to work, or he didn't want to work, or something like that. And so the point that I had been trying to make was like he didn't seem that into it.
Yeah.
He didn't seem that into the startup, didn't seem that into the product. And as an example, I sort of summarized as well to say, on a Sunday, but it was a Sunday where we were all in the same place, and me and my co-founder were working on it, and he was there, but he just wasn't really into. So he wasn't into the product, right?
Yeah.
He wasn't into the startup. He wasn't into the whole thing, and the people who complained about what I said like, oh, you shouldn't be expecting people to work Sundays and all that jazz, and I agree with those people. I definitely come sort of down the middle between the people who are staunchly, there are 40 hours a week and no one will ever think about their employer outside those 40 hours. And on the other side, the people who, think crunch time is necessary. So I'm down for like a practical middle of like, you shouldn't have people burn out. But at the same time, people should be, I generally prefer to people who are on mission.
Yeah.
And day one of a startup mission does involve a little crunching, usually.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you as I always do. I think crunch time should be for emergencies and should be avoided at all costs.
Yeah.
Not all costs.
Not
but
all cost yet. Yeah, there is a cost. I mean, it's debt in I know it's sleep debt. It's burnout debt. It's one of those things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was going to say this might be a tangent, which means it is a tangent. I'm kind of burnt out on running. Like I just decided I was running too much, and
Well, you did 50 miles last week, right?
I did 50 miles.
It's a lot of miles.
It wasn't really the physical cost of it. Like, because like I rode my bike to work. It was more, it's just like, wow, I've been on my feet for 13 hours. I would rather be spending that time doing something else.
Right. And I guess when you're running, there's all these like work thoughts going through your head. It's like, oh, I really have to send that email. I have to, I really want to ship that product or respond to that thing. You have the idea in your head. And then by the time you get there, it's like 13 hours have passed and you're exhausted. And
yeah, I was like, I would be much happier if I'd gone running for like, 4 or 5 hours.
Right.
And then worked for 8 hours.
Yeah. I mean, that's still a lot of hours.
Yeah, but I mean, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is my work is now more exciting than my running.
Right.
Because I'm like, gosh, I want to get all this stuff done at work. Instead,
Well,
I'm like,
it's a good time when that stuff is happening because there's some parts of doing a startup where it's like, oh, I really want to do anything else other than address the thing I need to address.
I guess there's nothing like running 50 miles in the rain to make you want to go back to work. I think, as always, we're in agreement. Are there any angles we haven't looked at for this crunch time and how it fits back into continuous delivery?
I think there's two things. So one is bad
planning,
bad management.
Well,
right?
there's two factors: bad management and bad planning. And if you combine those two, it's a furnace.
Let me try that again. There's a bad culture, right? So people who have a culture where it's like, sometimes we work late to ship a product. I'm totally fine with that. But anyone who's espousing crunch time as a permanent state of affairs, or sort of like looks down on the peons coding in their caves to like produce more products, peons. And there was one that I saw recently that there was do you know Alex St. John?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he had a blog post.
Oh, that was
A presentation.
yeah.
Right?
That
It
was
wow. Yeah, I know, right?
well, wow, on so many levels.
I read Alex St. John's stuff in like the 90s when he had the back page in like PC Gamer or PC Hardware or something like that, right? He was talking about like DirectX and what it did with games. And I was like, oh my God, this guy's amazing. And he almost made the template for what would become Evangelist, the entire evangelism space. But when you read that thing, you're like, holy shit, like I'm amazed anyone would say this in public. Some people think it, I guess, but like to put it in a presentation and...
Why did you think it was so retro? Like, because like everything about it was just so like stereotypes.
Yeah, so it was just pure stereotypes. I mean, the obvious one is like get the girlfriend or wife on board, and like assumption one that the engineer is always male, which
And male and straight.
Male and straight, and so that may be a thing which is still statistically valid, but I think we're certainly at a place in the industry where it's not okay to say that anymore, or to perpetuate that stereotype anymore. And then the idea just like, oh, we're gonna hire these little aspie kids and we're gonna put them in a cave and we're gonna work them until they quit. And it's like, here's how to offset the economics of hiring a more experienced person. We'll just give them 5 more kids.
Well, that was so
wrong.
The beginning story when I talked about the friend who was working 80 hours, he also had he would hire kids out of Waterloo. So Waterloo has a co-op program.
Yeah,
Waterloo's
right,
in
yeah,
Canada.
yeah.
So he would hire 10 college kids who really didn't know much.
Yeah.
With the theory that with 10 cheapest kids, he can reproduce one experienced person. But
Right.
really what you have is chaos.
And one experienced person is much cheaper than 10 kids.
Yeah, and what you have when you have 10, 19-year-olds
Yeah.
is chaos.
So it's interesting because I think the games industry is one of these places where kids grow up really being into games.
And that was the point of the article. It's
Right.
like, well, if you love games, you should put the time in.
Well, if you love games, that doesn't mean that you should be exploited.
Yeah.
Right? Because people love games so much, it makes them ripe for basically being exploited.
Yeah.
And I did some time in the games industry just when I finished college. And I saw this, the pay is much, much worse. The working hours are fucking terrible. But you do get a lot of cultural benefits. It's a lot more casual and kind of what you're looking for. And I think one of the great things about San Francisco and Silicon Valley is that it has all the upsides of that casual culture without exploiting you.
Yeah, I mean, for our own company, I've tried to follow the advice. So I had an ex-boss named Anne Duane. She's brilliant, like just absolutely brilliant. One of the best things I did was work for her. And I remember when I showed up to work, it was my first week, and I'm like, well, Anne, what hours should I be working? And she said, I don't care.
Right.
I'm like, what? And she's like, I'm very results driven. Mm-hmm. Like, increase our revenue by 15% this year. 20% would be better.
Right.
And I don't care what hours you work.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. And I went off and I increased our revenue by about 20%. I think actually 25%.
Right.
But she's like, I don't care if you get here at 8:30 or 9:30. Like, that's not my bag.
Yeah.
She's very formal, so she didn't say that's not my bag.
Yeah. I have a friend who has mandatory office hours in his company, and the hours are something like 10 to 7 or 9
to
9 to 7, something like that.
I thought you were gonna say
like I know what you're thinking, right? It's like everyone should be in the office noon to 2 so we can collaborate and have meetings during that time. That's not it.
10 to 7.
Right. And the thing is
mandatory.
Right. And I'm amazed, but it appears to be working for him.
In terms of,
As he's able to hire people. The people are high morale. They're delivering a lot. They're enjoying themselves.
I personally don't know if I would enjoy that.
I don't think I would either. But I think he's also looking to hire there is a persona that he's looking for, which is sort of the Bain analyst kind of persona, and then that's his background as well. And I think they work well in that kind of culture, or at least that's my understanding. But I would be out the door.
Yeah, so for my company, we have people who have kids, and sometimes so they take every Wednesday morning off, which is great.
Yep.
And they work Sunday afternoon.
Yep.
And so you might say, oh, we're exploiting them because they're working Sunday afternoons. It's like, no,
Right.
I'm you get some time with your family on Wednesday.
Yeah. Now there is a downside with that in that most people I know, if you ask them to do something on Sunday evening, it's like, oh, I can't. I've got a bit of work to do. And so that's like this refrain that I hear everywhere, because certainly, people take a little bit of time off to do their personal stuff, but the work becomes all encompassing. Even just the fact that you have email or that people speak to each other on Slack, you check your board, you check your work email, you start to think about work.
I'm really bad.
Yeah. People don't get as much time off. They don't get as much time to clear their heads and think about things that aren't work. And some people enjoy that. And even the people who enjoy that feel stress and burnout as a result of it.
Yeah, I think...
Or contributes at least.
I think Slack was supposed to save us, but it's made things worse.
I don't think it did, yeah. Kind of having...
It's this always on thing.
It's this always on thing that you feel you constantly have to keep up with as well. You feel you have to read the backtrace and
it's not threaded.
It's not threaded, and
that's the thing that kills me. So even if you have
can
separate
thread
rooms,
to channels, kind of. Yeah.
But then, so if you're following, so for us, it's like, oh, we're discussing a support ticket, and then there's a bunch of gifts, then we start talking, and it's like,
yeah. There's no end to the conversation.
Yeah.
So I think threading is a reasonable technical solution, but there's just a problem in our. Not just our industry, but in our lives, the fact that we're carrying a computer around with us all the time.
All the time.
Yeah. And if it's not work that's pinging you, it's like, there's just lots of messages that you have to reply to and lots of things you have to do. I turned off
your co-host telling you it's Tuesday.
I turned off my email notifications about 3 years ago
that must
on my
have
phone.
Felt so good.
And then I turned off all notifications about a month ago.
I have just started to try to wean myself into turning on Do Not Disturb at night.
Oh, so there's a setting on your iPhone where you can turn on Do Not Disturb automatically. And so I have it go from 12:01 a.m. until 12 a.m. So it's just like permanent Do Not Disturb.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is this? Huh.
And if I turn off Do Not Disturb, which I'm waiting for a call, waiting for a text, someone, whatever, it'll get turned on again at night.
Wow.
Yeah, it's great. Highly recommend it.
This is why you look so relaxed. I thought it was just.
I think it is why I look so relaxed. I also gave up sugar for April.
I thought it was the Launch Darkly shirt that made you look so cool, but it's really the Do Not Disturb.
It's either the sugar or lack thereof, or the fact that I'm sleeping well, or the fact that I turned off the notifications. I'm not sure which.
Yeah, all of it, or the haircut.
That could be it too. Or the fact that I'm not in perpetual crunch time.
I think to tie it all back to continuous delivery, well, let me go away from continuous delivery. I think the combination of poor management, poor culture, and poor planning sometimes cause a bonfire of crunch time.
Yep.
Where it's basically this culture of like, well, people work 80 hours a week. What if they did that all the time?
Right. And I generally come down to planning as the problem here.
Well,
That with better, I don't want to say PMing, but just choose better what you ship. You probably don't need to spend all that time.
or refuse to have a culture
Yes.
which says that this is...
Well, the two work together nicely.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of To Be Continuous, brought to you by HeavyBit and hosted by me, Paul Bigger of Circle CI, and Edith Harbaugh of Launch Darkly.
To learn more about HeavyBit, visit heavybit.com. While you're there, check out their library, home to great educational talks from other developer company founders and industry leaders.